So today's panel, the first panel, is titled Historicizing the Present. Tamim did a wonderful job, I think, explaining the importance of the past in the present and the present in the past. But I also think that when we put the concept of this conference together, we thought about having a thread that cuts across time and space in our region. Any fruitful discussion about the present-day challenges in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine, or any projections into their future, would be enriched by a thorough understanding of the region's modern history. So I have with me 4 panelists today, 2 of whom are sadly unable to join us in person, but they will be on the screen with us. And their work focuses on the histories of 4 major cities in the region: Damascus, Beirut, Haifa, and Amman. I will briefly introduce my panelists, who will each present their work for about 8 to 10 minutes, before we then have a short discussion amongst each other and then open it up for a Q&A. So Dr. Sami Mbayit, who's on the screen above me, is a Syrian historian, former Carnegie Scholar, and founding chairman of the Damascus History Foundation. He has written extensively on the contemporary history of Damascus from the late Ottoman era until the Syrian-Egyptian Union of 1958. Dr. Sanat Nouri Karam, who's with me here on the stage, is a historian of the modern Middle East, writing on the intellectual and cultural history of the Arab left. She is currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Lebanese Studies at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Himmat Zabi, also on the screen, is a Palestinian researcher and postdoctoral fellow of Europe and the Middle East and Europe in Berlin. Her work focuses on gender, urban politics and settler colonialism, memory and oral history, and indigenous knowledge and resistance. And finally, Dr. Eliana Abu Hamdi is an urbanist, designer, and Middle East scholar who is currently the program manager for the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative at MIT. Her research on architecture and development in Jordan contributes to debates on the political economy of urbanism in developing cities. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Sami to begin the panel with his intervention.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jumana. My voice is fine. Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you in person due to unforeseen health reasons, but anyway. I'm going to be speaking today about modernity in Damascus. This is the topic of my new book, how the Syrian capital, one of the oldest cities in the world, was able to move from a very traditional, closed, conservative, Puritan society in the 19th century into a modern metropolis with life, with programs for emancipation of women, women empowerment, a healthy political culture, and a major revival of the social network in Syria and how in Damascus and how the city looks like. Now, it all boils back to actually to the Ottoman era, to the famous Tanzimat, which began in 1939, which were in response to European pressure on the Ottoman Sultan to modernize the empire. That came at the heels of an Egyptian invasion of Syria and an occupation that lasted between 1831 and 1840, which actually witnessed the greatest reform era that the city has known in modern times. Judicial courts, equal rights for Christians and other minorities. The Egyptians had a profound effect. Modern schools, instead of the kutab that only taught the Quran, those brief years of Egyptian rule were actually a major catalyst for the Ottomans to move forward with their Tanzimat in 1939, which eventually created a middle class of Syrians Previously, there was a class of notables associated to the Ottoman administration, and there were the poor. A middle class began to emerge that was able to change society at different levels. One of those people, for example, was Abu Khalil al-Qabbani, great-grandfather of Nizar Qabbani, who introduced modern theater into the city in 1873. Modern theater with dancing, with music. Eventually, he had three theaters working at the same time in Damascus. Early on, you didn't have women acting, but men were playing the roles of women. If you look through the list of his young amateur actors, you will find someone like Atal Ayyubi, who went on later to become Prime Minister of Syria in 1936. Notables from very respected, prominent, urban notable Sunni families who defied the social customs of Damascus and went into acting, making the profession a little bit acceptable throughout society. It wasn't accepted among the religious clerics, among the mashayikh and the ulama, who remained the main obstacle to change in Damascus. They closed down Qabbani's theater. They forced him to flee to Egypt, but it didn't end there. That triggered a conflict between young men who wanted to change their societies, who saw potential in an ancient city like Damascus to move forward, and with the religious establishment. Now, you had several milestones in the contemporary history of Damascus. One was the beginning of the building of modern hospitals under Sultan Abdul Hamid, starting with the Hamidian Hospital in Al-Baramke. By hospitals, that meant better medicine, that meant better medical treatment, longer life for Syrians. Then came, it was a major turnover in the history of the city, the establishment of the Ottoman medical faculty, Kulliyat al-Tubb. It wasn't really established with the hope of, let's say, inspiring a new generation towards change. The original catalyst over the opening of the Ottoman Medical School, which later created the nucleus of Damascus University. The original purpose of that was to challenge the medical schools that were already operating nearby. One was the American University of Beirut, and one was the Jesuit University in Beirut. The Ottoman Sultan considered them breeding ground for dissent and for spies and for encouraging minorities to rise up against his rule. So he reasoned that if he creates an alternate school over which he has full control in a city like Damascus, that would prevent Arabs from traveling to Beirut and studying at the hands of Christian missionary schools. But the effect of the Damascus Faculty of Medicine was profound on society. It created a young, new class of highly educated youth. Initially, it was all male. Women started entering in 1931, which is avant-gardist in its own right, although much later than when the university was actually first started in 1903. But with time, that university became the most prestigious among its peers. It began graduating generation after another of highly qualified medical doctors. It soon expanded to include a faculty of pharmacology. And by 1913, 10 years later, a faculty of law. In 1907, there was a major shift towards modernity in Damascus with the establishment of electricity, and coming with it, the modern tramway, a modern form of public transport. 6 lines were established in Damascus, and along the banks of each line, a new city emerged. People began commuting between areas outside the old city. New buildings began to emerge, all built early into the French era, French Mandate era, early 1920s. And young people who studied abroad in London and Paris and Geneva came back from these cities and found that residential quarters very similar to those that they had seen in Europe had started to emerge in their own city. They moved collectively out of old Damascus into what we now call the new areas of Damascus that were established in the 1920s. And from these modern districts, we're talking, if anyone is familiar with Damascus neighborhoods like Al-Salhiyah, Al-Sha'lan, the new elite began to emerge. And this is the elite that led modernity, that took modernity that it had saw in Europe. It had been influenced by European values, by secularism. They came back to their city with very ambitious ideas about separating religion from politics. They took these views into their jobs, whether it was in public service, whether it was at newspapers, or those who returned to teach at Damascus University. And thus, there was a transfer of knowledge and ideas to a new generation of Syrians. That generation that we're talking about was elected, its young men were elected to parliament in 1919, right after the Ottomans had left the city. And from within parliament, which at the time we called the Syrian National Congress, they lobbied to give women the right to vote and to hold public office. Now, that in itself was very revolutionary. It never passed, by the way. Discussed early on, but it never passed because conservatives drowned the subject. They refused to have it penned into law or for it to be put into the constitution. It kept on being delayed until that parliament was dissolved by the invading French army on the 24th of July, 1920. Now, with colonial France, we usually treat the colonial era in a matter much harsher than it deserves in terms of legacy, because the French era in Syria, just like the British in Palestine and Iraq and Egypt, they left behind several important institutions, and they really helped change the mentality of Syrians. Now, one of the main things that France did was try to reduce or clip the wings of the clerical establishment. They reduced funding for religious schools. They tried to slowly dismantle the extremely powerful network that the clerics had over society through several positions, like they were in charge of the post of preacher of the Umayyad Mosque, the Naqabat al-Ashraf, several very important positions that had outlived the Ottoman era, many of them position of the Grand Mufti, which had been created under the Ottomans. So there was a serious attempt by the French at curbing the influence of the clerical society. In 1936, I think there's one episode that hasn't received its due mention in history books. The French passed law number 60, which allowed Syrians to move from one religion to another and from one sect to another, or to abandon their religion altogether. That law, had it passed, you can just imagine what it would have done. And the law also said that if you want to change your religion or sect, all you have to do is inform the state. You no longer need to inform your church or your mosque. It also allowed Muslim women to marry Christians. In Islam, you can do the opposite. A Muslim male can marry a Christian, but a Muslim woman cannot marry a non-Muslim. What's interesting about this law is that the Syrian government, which represented the national bloc, led by urban notables from the city of Damascus, they approved it. That's how far secularism and modernity had reached in Syria. This is 1937. The law had been in debate since 1926, so it took 11 years of debate and discussion, and several prime ministers had refused to sign it off, saying that it was too controversial, until Jamil Mardambek, who was leader of the nationalist movement as well, approved that law, and so did Justice Minister Abdurrahman Kayali. Now, if we look into the background of these people, Abdurrahman Kayali was a medical doctor trained at the American University of Beirut. Jamil Mardambek was a full-time politician trained at the École Supérieure in Paris. These were secular men who were not afraid to voice their views. Even leader of the opposition at the time, Abdurrahman al-Shahabandar, although he had an axe to grind with these politicians, he also supported such a law. Now, those who didn't approve it, of course, were the clerics. And, Jamil Mardambek was forced to withdraw his support when he received death threats he ignored. Then, while en route to attend the opening of the Beirut port, which was devastated by the deadly explosion of August 2020, when he was en route to attend the opening of the Marfa Beirut, the port of Beirut, a bomb exploded next to his car, which was a very clear death threat from the clerics that if you go any further on the secularism law, we'll have you killed. Will kill every other person who supports it. It didn't pass, but the fact that it was raised shows you how far society had reached by the 1930s, very much thanks to France's endorsement of a secular Syria and the weakening of the clerical establishment, the conscious weakening of the clerical establishment by consecutive Syrian leaders and the Mandate regime. Now, this secularism trend and all that we just discussed accumulated between the years 1949 to 1950 on two occasions. And we're talking here, by 1946, the French had left. Syria had achieved its independence. In 1949, Colonel Hasni Zaim formally gave Syrian women the right to vote. He had been inspired by Ataturk, by the way. Although there are many reasons to criticize the man for aborting Syrian democracy with the first coup of the Arab world, nevertheless, he did push forth with several major reforms related to society. And then in 1950, there were talks for a discussions began after electing Constitutional Assembly to draft a new constitution for Syria. And, in light of the current constitutional talks that are underway, everybody discusses the Constitution of 1950 because of its political nature, because of the empowerment of the Prime Minister's office and the parliament at the expense of the presidency. But there's a really important episode that took place during the discussions of 1950 was when the Muslim Brotherhood, which was present in parliament, pushed for a law trying to make Islam the religion of the state. Up till then, all constitutions in Syria did not mention such a clause. Under the French and in the early independence era, the constitution said that Islam is the source of tashri', of jurisprudence, but it was not the religion of the state, because that threatened Kurds and that threatened non-Muslims basically, and put them as second-grade citizens, as they described it. In 1950, the topic was discussed in the press, in parliament, among students at university. A heated debate was raised on how should Syria look like in the future. Is it really an Islamic country, or should it be more open to it? At the time, the name was not the Syrian Arab Republic, it was just the Syrian Republic. And the Muslim Brotherhood, backed by the clerics and by traditionalists and conservatives, not just the official institutions or like the mosque, the Department of Endowments, backed also by conservative society, they were unable to push through with that law. And again, that shows you that society was moving in the right direction. That despite the coups of the years 1949 to 1970, society was beginning to take on a very liberal, pro-Western, secular, if I may say, image, which did not last. One reason for that is that those who led the liberal movement, the modernists, al-mutanawwirun, those who were the enlightened, they had been young and powerful in the 1920s when they had just returned from their studies abroad and came back to influence society, whether through political parties or through the press or through their positions as professors at Damascus University. By the 1960s and 70s, those who were still alive had become too old. They had lost political power by the coups and counter-coups that rocked Syria. They had lost economic influence by the socialist measures that were imposed on Syria by Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1958 to 1961. They lost their ability to influence. And thus, the agents of change were no longer there. The post-urban notability elite that came, military elite that came to power, they understood secularism from an entirely different perspective. They understood secularism as trashing religion, not separating religion from state. They understood, they went as far as, for example, the word Allah, God, was banned from being mentioned in Syrian newspapers. At one point in time, there was even a discussion that was raised about closing down the Umayyad Mosque and transforming it into a secular museum, just like Atatürk did with Hagia Sophia.
Sami?
These measures,
I don't know if
yes,
you can hear me. I'm sorry, but sorry to interrupt you. I think we need to wrap up to move on to the other speakers, but I think...
I'm done.
Okay.
I'm done. Yes. So I'm sorry for that. I got carried away. That's how it ended. That's how it began. That's how it ended. It's a pity this hasn't been studied, but we're trying to come up with a literature that does that period justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sami. I think it's quite interesting to hear your intervention. I don't know if you also listened to Tamim's speech before the panel, but it's quite two different perspectives on what modernization represents for the region. Tamim was speaking about modernization in its face as a vehicle of political servility and economic dependence and military vulnerability. And you're talking about the avenues for secularization and education and women's rights that were opened up through the process of modernization. So it quite shows the different facets of the same debate. And I think it's actually an interesting segue to move on to Sana's presentation now. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jumana, and thank you everyone for being here and for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. So I will introduce very briefly, before going into what I exactly work on, just to set the stage of how the Levant, if we want to call it so, or the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire looked like at the end of the Ottoman rule. So kind of what Sami talked about a little bit. So what happens at the end of Ottoman rule, by the end of World War I, is that there is a sudden shift of, obviously, of rule. So the Ottoman Empire falls with the end of World War I, with its defeat. It's a sudden collapse because people who were living within the Ottoman Empire did not actually expect this to happen. So the collapse was a result of the defeat during World War I. The whole worldview of the people living in that region suddenly also collapses. What they're faced with is direct Western colonialism through the mandate system. We can talk a little bit more about what the mandate system is and what kind of colonial rule it was. But what's important to note is that what the inhabitants of that region suddenly have to face is this direct Western colonialism, but also an extreme, basically takeover of their markets, of their lives, of their political systems by this Western imperialism. So in the late Ottoman period, we had already seen in the region already the modern capitalist system starts to creep into the different markets of the Ottoman Empire. There are various attempts by the different Western powers to take different regions of the Ottoman Empire, but it doesn't really happen as immensely and as strongly as we see in 1920 and by the end of World War I. So this is kind of to set the stage of what society and politics looked like, whether in Lebanon, but also in Syria and Palestine with the coming of the French and the British mandates to that region. And so the individuals who are living and the inhabitants of that region are trying to basically to come to terms with this new system of rule, which is colonialism, which is also newly created states of Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan a little bit later as well. And there are various ways in which they, or various positions also, in which they place themselves and in which they decide to either fight this new system, to find themselves within it, to try to adjust to that rule, and to also, to position themselves in relation to power, basically. And so the individuals I actually work on are mostly Lebanese, but also Syrian and Palestinian Arabs, who during that period basically found communism and leftist ideas to be kind of an answer to a lot of these problems that they were facing, so including colonialism, capitalism. In the case of Lebanon, sectarianism, and we can talk about how sectarianism also is a remnant of Western imperialism's intervention in late Ottoman period, but it gets really institutionalized under the French mandate in Lebanon. And so leftists in Lebanon, which is mostly what I work on, they are appalled by this basically legitimization of sectarianism rather than secularism. They are trying to also fight colonialism and to gain national independence. They are individuals who basically see also the link between capitalism and imperialism, and how the various French companies were already owning a lot of the services, a lot of the companies that open up in Lebanon and Syria, including the tramway company that Sami mentioned. And they're gaining monopolies over these various companies and services. So these leftists are realizing how much capitalism and imperialism are linked. They're also very much aware by the 30s and the late 30s specifically of the rise of fascism around the world, but also in the Arab region. And so they are also basically trying to fight fascism through different leftist and socialist ideas. And these are individuals who are going to organize syndicates. They're going to also organize basically along class lines, which is going to be very different from how the sectarian political parties in Lebanon are going to organize. There's a lot that I can talk about in terms of how they do what they do and the kind of politics that they make possible that is different from either the nationalist way of organizing, but also the sectarian political parties that emerge in Lebanon. But what I do want to say is that these particular individuals, what they also give us is a different way of looking at the world at the time. So not only are they thinking, in secular terms, like Sami mentioned, they're thinking in anti-sectarian terms. They're thinking about anti-imperialism as a major way of living, but also of fighting the realities that are being imposed on them. But these are individuals who are also thinking beyond the nation state. So they're thinking internationalism. They're thinking that the Soviet Union is going to be kind of the salvation out of the world system that they live in, out of imperialism, out of capitalism. Of course, what's going to happen is a lot of them, they're going to be also disillusioned and basically disappointed by this world power that for them represented at the time, so before the end of World War II, that represented at the time this beacon of hope for anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, democratic way of rule. And what this also shows us, specifically on the individuals that I work on, is that a lot of them refuse to follow the authoritarianism that starts emerging within the Soviet Union as well, and within leftist parties. And this is something I will conclude with, and basically just to say, why is it important to to study leftist thought and leftists in 20th century Lebanon and the region. And that is to say, first, that there were individuals who for them, a certain way of thinking and leftist principles were an answer to a lot of the problems that they faced, including, as I said, imperialism, capitalism, colonialism, all kinds of injustice. But also there are some individuals, these are individuals who, for them, authoritarianism, even within the left, which is something that we will see emerging in the Arab world in the mid-20th century, but also later from various parts, of course, not just from within the left. These are individuals who will refuse also to follow even the, if we want to call it the dictatorship within the left or the authoritarian trends that emerge within the left, including the Soviet Union's increasingly authoritarian tendencies within the left. And this is something important today if we want to talk about the left within the Arab world and what it represents and the kind of differences that do exist today within the left in the Arab world, but also worldwide. And I'm sure we can talk more about that if you want in the Q&A about the role of leftist ideas, but also of Russia in the Arab world today, and or basically the remnants of the Soviet Union. But yeah, this is just a brief overview of the left in Lebanon during the mandate.
Thank you, Sana. I think it's also quite interesting to hear your input after listening to Tamim and Sami, and it's almost as if there was room for both an anti-sectarian and an anti-imperialist movement, but sadly we still don't see this movement flourishing. We're always, I think, in the region, we seem to be stuck in binaries. And those of us who are from Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, I guess, can relate very well to being cast as either pro-Western and today, maybe in the old days, pro-Soviet Union, now it's pro-Iran. So yeah, we're struggling to find a movement that can represent the values that we hold dear to us. So I won't comment for too long. I'll just pass on to Himmat. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jumana. Can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
Perfect. Thank you, Jumana, and thank you, everyone. And I'm also joining Sami with my apology of not being able to join you. I will share my screen so we can visualize some of the things that been said by Sami and Sana, and I will take you to Palestine in that transitional period between the British colonialism and the Israeli settler colonialism. I'll try to read, so I stuck to the time. I hope that I will make it. So much has been written about Israel's so-called mixed cities, a term that more than anything reveals how exceptional they are in a country where separation is a foundational concept. But the story of the urban Palestinian bourgeois, the group that the Palestinian researcher Shireen Saïd referred to as men of capital in the year following the Nakba, has yet to be told. The story of a Boutaji family following the Nakba, during which hundreds of thousands of Palestinians either fled or were expelled from their homeland, but maybe more importantly, were forcibly prevented from returning, is the exception that proves the rule. The efforts the family made to remain and the reasons it eventually left Haifa a few years later illustrate the new reality al-mutabaqqun, those who remained in their homeland. A reality full of absurdity and complexity, reality that challenges the binary that Jumana mentioned of heroism and weakness, of complicity and resistance. At the same time, it is a story that exposes the deception of coexistence in Israel, as well as the falsehood that Israel has brought democracy, progress, and economic prosperity to Palestine. With that, it further challenges the binary narrative that identifies Israelness with modernity and with the West, as opposed to Palestinians identified as anti-modern conceptions that are still dominated in Israel and in the West, and are part of the agnotology, the deliberate ignorance about Palestine and the Palestinians. So let me start with the story of the family, the Boutaji family, in the 19th century, which was one lightening fast growth and prosperity across the Ottoman Empire. The time also saw major economic, social, and cultural changes as a result, as Sami extended on, as a result of the Tanzimat. Haifa al-Jadida, and I use Haifa with Y to refer to Haifa before the Nakba, benefited greatly from these changes. The city's location along the coast, the expansion of its port, the gradual growth of its trade with Europe, alongside the construction of the Hijaz Railroad, turned Haifa into a center of maritime and continental commerce. This development encouraged merchant families and capitalists from other cities in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon to move to the city. The Boutaji, which originally moved to Haifa from Akka, was one of these families. So Théophile Boutaji, who would go on to establish the family business, T.S. Boutaji and Sons, was born in Haifa, already from the middle of the 1920s, and thanks, among other things, to the family British citizenship, the Boutaji business specialized in importing goods from Europe. These goods fit the taste of the local as well as the European in the city, including European Jews who settled in it. The business continued to expand, opening branches in Jaffa, and Jerusalem, Al-Quds. And the family owned property, including a beach in Haifa, a Westdor hotel in Haifa, and Jerusalem hotel in Jaffa. So during the first half of the 20th century, the freedom of movement and the open borders in Bilad al-Sham, or what is known as the Levant, was a significant factor in the economic, social, cultural prosperity in the Palestinian cities. This freedom of movement also helped strengthening Arab-Palestinian identity and stimulated Palestinian national aspiration. The blossoming of Haifa al-Jadida, including its public squares, cafes, and market, alongside the strengthening of the Arab language press, played a central role in this process. The growing opposition to the British colonialism and the Zionist settlement also strengthened Palestinian national aspiration, a process that led the outbreak of the Arab Revolt, Al-Thawra al-Kubra. The political position of Emil Boutaji, Théophile's son, who succeeded his father in running the family business via the Arab Revolt, were full of contradictions. For instance, the Hebrew language Do'ar Hayom reported in April 1936 on Emil's opposition to the general strike. 2 years later, the Hebrew Davar newspaper reported about a flyer signed by Emil called for donation for the Arab heroes of the revolt. One can assume that both reports were accurate and that he wanted to maintain the ability to move with ease between his capitalist aspirations and his good relations with the British on the one hand, and the growing Palestinian national aspiration on the other hand, at a time of conflict and risks. So the British Mandate authorities left Haifa in June 1948. From that moment, the spatial, economic, and social reality in the city changed drastically, particularly during Operation Shikmona, the Israeli operation launched to demolish Haifa al-Jadida following the war. And despite opposition and protest by the Palestinians, it was reported that in December 48, the great majority of the 3,200 Palestinians who remained in Haifa has already been moved to the ghetto. Like many other residents of Haifa, the Boutaji family tried as hard as they could to maintain at least part of their previous lives. For example, on June 30, 1948, Emil Boutaji sent a letter addressed to the Haifa police asking to visit his family store in Java Road in the city. The same day, he sent a similar letter to Moshe Shetrit, the Foreign Affairs Minister, regarding his failed attempt to visit family store in Yafa. And 2 weeks later, Boutaji sent another letter to attorney Yaakov Salomon to get permission to visit his farm in Tel Emil near Haifa. So in an attempt to remove the restrictions imposed on his business and to prevent the transfer of his family to the ghetto, Boutaji once again tried to use his ability to maneuver between conflicts. Carefully, he tried to elicit members of the new regime to meet his demands, while emphasizing that in return, he would be willing to collaborate with them. In July, Boutaji sent a confidential letter to Minister of Labor and Construction, which included a request not to move him and his family to the ghetto. In the letter, Boutaji expressed his loyalty to the new state. He also emphasized his Christian background and encouraged Bentov, the minister, to win the friendship of the Christians, both Arab and non-Arabs. Boutaji also recommended Bentov to contact the great Bishop Mubarak of Beirut, who is a very strong supporter of the Jewish state, and he offered his help in doing so. To increase the chances that his requests would be granted, Boutaji also denied that he was an Arab. I quote, "First of all, I'm not an Arab, as my family hails from Malta, and we have been living in Israel for a considerable number of years," end of quote. So the document in the archive do not provide an indication as to whether Boutaji's request was granted. However, we do know that he claims that the import license granted to him after 48 was limited, and that the term of the license were much more restricted than the terms of those granted to other Israeli Jewish merchants at the time. So this reality led Boutaji to send another letter to the Minority Affairs Minister, Bachor Shetrit, in April 48, about a year after the Nakba, in which he asked for help leaving the country. This request was seen by Shetrit as a pure personal affair, one that did not concern his office. It's evident that the reality did not improve for Boutaji family in the following year. And in 1952, Boutaji published an ad in the British press seeking to sell his property. And a few years later, he left Palestine after he gave an interview to Ma'arif newspaper, which he concluded by saying, "I feel imprisoned in Israel." So for المتبقون الفلسطينيين who remained in their hometown, the creation of Haifa marked the outset of the devastation of Haifa with Y. The city's urban cosmopolitanism was devastated by cutting Palestinians off from the Bilad Sham, eliminating the channels for prosperity and economic and cultural networks. Israel population management was characterized by by separation of Arabs and Jews, and the persecution and persistent rejection of Palestinian national identity, along with blocking the access of non-Jews to exclusively Jewish sovereignty. So I will conclude by saying something about the present and how this is relevant to our nowadays. So the prolonged colonialism in Palestine and the ongoing Nakba make the past and the present undividable. The Boutaji family had left Palestine, but the essence of the settler colonial policies which made them leave hasn't changed much. But also the built-in contradictions between the Palestinian national identity and their Israeli citizenship has not came to an end. However, there remain Palestinians, and especially the new generation in Haifa and elsewhere, are trying to manipulate these contradictions and to constantly struggle for reviving their history, maintaining their narrative, and reclaiming their cities. They also struggle to expose the untruth widespread narrative in the West, which claim that Israel has brought democracy and progress, and that the Palestinians who became citizens in the Israeli state enjoy full rights. At the same time, they persistently renewing and maintaining the multiple channels that used to connect them with the world, especially with the Arab-speaking countries where they naturally belong. And thank you.
Thank you, Hima. Thank you so much for this presentation. Actually, I think that the story you told about the Boutaji family links very well with Tamim's characterization of the Israeli population as, in its entirety, as the elite. The Boutaji family is an economic elite that was not allowed to even serve the colonial master. So it's very interesting to see how all of these different parts and pieces are fitting together in this first session today. And I think your presentation, Himmat, also links well with Eliana's presentation now. If we're speaking about the ongoing Nakba and the refugee, Palestinian refugees, then it's very characteristic of Amman as well. So please, Eliana, go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you. My research is deeply historical, but I think well-crafted as it may be. I'll be talking about a contemporary case study, though it's a historical provocation. If I'm staring down here, that's where the screen is. So I will try eye contact, but that's where it is. So a series of political conflicts and the loss of the West Bank in 1967 weakened the Jordanian state and threatened its military might. In an era where government stability was essential to maintaining legitimacy and sovereignty, the weight of defeat lay heavy on the monarchy. Stability was further eroded by increasingly diverse populations, with Jordanians outnumbered by Palestinians so severely that the Israeli government kind of provocatively said, "Jordan is Palestine," targeting Jordan's decades-long sense of insecurity over a perceived lack of distinct Jordanian identity. The notion of a unified Jordanian identity has been challenged throughout the state's short history. Since its inception under the British rule in 1921, political allegiances were arranged by systems of tribal communalism and parochialism. Although Abdullah I succeeded in harboring allegiance amongst Jordan's various tribes during his brief reign as king, a true and united national identity was tenuous at best. Allegiances were further fractured as Amman's Circassian refugee community, settled in the late 18th century, was joined by flows of Palestinians and later Iraqi refugees after the Gulf War of 1991 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and eventually, as we all know, the Syrians of 2011, rendering Amman a capital city of lost nations and often conflicting identities. The influx of refugees throughout the history of Jordan created moments of interruption in city planning and subsequently the opportunity for the lapse in accountability regarding developmental decisions made by various municipal administrations. In this way, the state, albeit not a monolithic actor, employed the disruption caused by each influx of refugees as an opportunity to rewrite the systems of planning. These systems, however, as history reveals, were only to be interrupted by the next influx of refugees, and so planning in Amman has been historically unregulated. Amman's development is complicated first by these refugee interruptions, second, by the limited efficacy of the greater Amman municipality, and finally, that did not move, sorry. And finally, by a continual divergence between private and public interests, primarily made problematic due to the lack of state land holdings and the power of tribal landowners and the political clout of their elite. Through my research on Amman in the contemporary moment, I study the process of neoliberal urbanism and shift the critique to the built environment, recognizing the architecture within it as a significant actor in the process of transformation. Specific to Amman, two neoliberal projects, the Jordan Gate Towers and the Limitless Towers, demonstrate that neoliberal restructuring can very much manifest as a political project. Unplanning, in this case, simply means unregulated planning in the form of weak policy, the re-scripting of the state's role in planning, and split allegiances due to strong tribal identities. The reason, I argue, why unregulated planning is preferred is because it allows a certain range of autonomy for the state when it is not confined to planning restrictions. Perhaps the most troubling of all of these unregulated undertakings in this neoliberal era is the Jordan Gates Towers, the land for which was acquired through an inversion of the planning practice of eminent domain. That is, public land was claimed for private use, and so construction began the following year in 2005. Today, 17 years after the much celebrated groundbreaking, the towers stand half-built and the work site is deserted. The construction cranes, at this point as much a fixture of the skyline as the towers themselves, still stand in place. As if fixed in time, the cranes loom over the city, a constant reminder of the nebulous condition of the project. Stuck in a liminal space of conception and incompletion, the towers are a monument to the entrenched system of incentivized development, haphazard administrative decisions, and above all, as an unserviceable and inaccessible ruin, a relic of market-driven urbanism. While other projects in Amman have been similarly interrupted, none stand as close to and simultaneously as far from completion as the Jordan Gates. The Limitless Towers you see here is another luxury housing and retail project that held a groundbreaking ceremony in 2008 and began excavations. But the project never progressed beyond the excavation stage. This crater left sits as it is, also as if frozen in time, surrounded by the withering posters advertising the project. Nevertheless, projects such as these continued to be pursued and initiated all over Amman, while planning officials are most problematically not held accountable for administrative decisions about planning projects, and we can only wonder why. The conundrum I have found lays in the fact that even in their current state, the incompleteness or failure of these projects can actually be financially desirable for the state and its oligarchic network, made profitable through the state's appropriation of public and privately held land as state domain, in turn selling the properties to private developers at a premium. Despite apparent ambivalence of municipal planners towards the success and failure of these neoliberal projects, Abdullah II's development agenda did receive pushback from general public. He sought to temper such opposition through the establishment of a nationalist agenda, building upon the sentiments of civic pride and support for the state-led development through a clever campaign tagline, Jordan First or Al-Urdun Awalan. Abdullah has thus built an identity for Jordan based on this nationalist agenda, a blind borrowing of cases from the global north, and the adoption of regional development practices. In this way, Jordan's development pursuits reinforce the global north's colonial hold over its landscapes, paving the path for neoliberal forms of urbanism. Dubai, unsurprisingly, plays a starring role in this urbanization scheme, acting as a symbol of high design and innovation. Dubai symbolizes economic vitality, modernity, and superlative architecture. It acts as a regional symbol of a global city, setting unachievable standards for many neighboring states, especially Jordan. Neoliberal urbanism in Amman attempted to simulate imported modernization schemes, building shopping malls, upscale apartment buildings, and spectacular high-rise towers. Those projects, however, never completed, have instead given way to a landscape marred by empty buildings, gaping holes, and the skeletal remains of speculative projects gone bust. Instead, due to their financial profitability, these practices continue to be deployed in the pursuit of the Dubai model of design and prosperity. Unchecked, however, globalization and the blind pursuit of relevance will continue to rearrange the meaning and purpose of architecture. All that will remain then is what Rem Koolhaas terms junk space, an architecture that is flamboyant yet unmemorable. In the race to create this modern milieu, planning for the Jordan Gate Towers and the Limitless Towers fell far short of achieving their goal. Examining these neoliberal projects not as icons, but as developmental failures, sheds light on a trend of ruination, or what I call ruination, in which incompleteness or project failure is not necessarily linked to economic loss. In this way, new neoliberal ruins and the perverse manner in which market inefficiencies have become financially desirable have persisted throughout the 2000s, even if socially and developmentally detrimental. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of development in Amman is that officials are not held accountable for administrative decisions about planning projects. There is simply little to no bureaucratic or financial consequence. The craters and cranes of both failed and ongoing projects speckle the city, while detours along the city streets attempt to divert drivers away from construction zones hidden behind temporary walls and gates, adorned with posters portraying a glimmering promise of a modern Amman. Each failed project is the product of a trend of ruination and an expression of a promise that historically has not and cannot be kept. Thank you.
Thank you for this actually very beautifully written presentation. And it's very strikingly similar to Lebanon, I think.
Yes.
We have a joke, like the only time any project gets done is 2 months before the elections. And yeah, that's basically it. So before I open this up to the Q&A, actually, let me just take a quick look at the time. I don't know, I'm at a loss at what to do at this moment. I think I would like to ask a couple of questions. I'll just limit them to 2 questions that I had prepared for the panelists before opening up the Q&A. And I encourage everyone, if you could also, if you have questions, to put them through the application, because I'm seeing them here, and then I'll call on you to ask the question in person if you're in the room, and people who are on the virtual platform, I'll just read their questions aloud. So I'll ask you all to be very brief in your answers, if possible. But I think the first question that I would like to ask Sami, that in our region, history is often seen as a rigid, boring, problematic subject, something that we ought to like move beyond and forget about if we're to make any progress in our societies. But I would ask you what, for you, is the importance of knowing this history or reading it with through the lens of the present, and basically, why should we care about the past at all?
Well, briefly and in a nutshell, because in our part of the world, we never studied it with the objective of learning from it. And we never wrote it in a manner that was aimed at educating a new generation and learning from mistakes of the past. Our version of history has always been a descriptive history, often written in very flowery Arabic, with no real analysis on why it happened, any event. I give you an example of 1860, the bloody massacres that took place in Mount Lebanon and in Damascus. The Lebanese inserted that bloodbath into their curriculum in 1914. Syrians just glossed over it, as if it never happened. it was even wrong to talk about it at a certain point in time. And as a result, we did not learn from our mistakes, and we have committed them time and again throughout the region. So I think the important thing is to learn from that history and to say it in a way that respects the human mind. Most of the versions that we've come across in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, is too simplistic. Good guys versus bad guys. We're always the victims. We're always the good guys, whereas it's not like that. I mean, if there was no major problem in the actual structure of our societies, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Well, thank
Brief
you.
enough?
Yes, very good. Thank you. I think you compensated for speaking at length in your intervention.
Okay.
Thank you, Sami. Second question I'm going to ask is to you, Sana. That I think it's kind of related to what Sami said, that, for example, I'm from Lebanon, and it's very hard to find sources to learn about my own history. There's either the official narrative of the state that ends in 1943, or maybe some Western scholars who have come and studied the region. So I want to ask you, does it matter who writes the history and who tells this story and how?
I mean, this is an excellent question. Thank you. Of course it does matter. I mean, it's not an issue of monopoly over who writes, right? I think everyone who has access to archives and to sources can write. But there is something to be said about people from a certain region writing their own history. There's something very empowering about owning the history. Because similar to what Sami said, there is something about first learning from the past, but also the past provides, and the past in the sense that Tamim explained, right? The past that just became the past as well, right, as we speak. So, because there's also an idea that the past is something that, happened a very long time ago, but really to think of this as not only, as I said, that's something that we should learn from, but it's something in which we can feel, we can explain our present, right? So, yes, most of our present doesn't look good. Hopefully the future will look better. I don't like to use these terms, but the idea here is that, yes, if we know our past, if we actually own it, I think it's very empowering. I think it allows us to understand why we are where we are. It allows us to move beyond just the bitterness, the anger most of the time. It allows us to think of ways out in which maybe we didn't think of before, but also to be able to be critical of our present and of ourselves. And that's why I think, again, no monopoly over who does that history. But I think it's very important that we write our own history too. There's something, there's a lot of talk about decolonizing the past and decolonizing history and different fields. But I think part of the actual decolonization of certain fields, including history, is for formerly colonized subjects to actually have access to their own history and to write it. And this is also an issue of archives. You asked about sources. It is an issue of archives as well, because for most of the region, the official archives, if we are to follow a very traditional sense of what the archive is and how to look for sources, the official kind of archives are either owned by states, which is something obviously that we see around the world, not only in the region, but in the case of post-colonial societies, it's owned by the former colonial powers as well. So there's also an issue of access. So if I am to write a history of Lebanon during the mandate, I have to face the fact of either going to the Lebanese state, which does not have a lot to start with on the mandate, or I have to travel to France. So there's already also an alienation that happens between me and, as a historian and the sources themselves. And that, I think, can be resolved through us reimagining what the archive is and who gets to say things about the past? So is it just state documents? Is it just colonial documents? Or can actually literature produced from the region, poetry, art, journals, memoirs of individuals from that region, are these historical documents, yes or no? And if we recenter kind of this, if we recenter power basically within the archive, I think we will be able to write also more elaborate and more powerful histories of our region.
Thank you, Sana. Actually, and I guess one thing I would add as well, I think you've been insinuating to that, but the kinds of questions that a person brings to the archive will be quite different depending on their position, right? And that actually is a good segue for me to ask Himmat a little bit about this, because you're a Palestinian doing research, and you have quite a challenge accessing archives. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about these challenges and how you try to navigate the constraints of doing research as a Palestinian.
Yeah, thank you, Jumana. This is really, I can't agree more of what Sana just said about the resources, but also your comment, as the researcher as a subject who set the questions. I can tell, and I can speak a lot about challenges of doing research in the Israeli archive and the difficulties. One story I can share with you briefly. When I started my research a few years ago, and I went to the first Israeli archive, the Haifa Municipality Archive, and I went in and I just presented my question, that I do research about Palestinian, about the Nakba, about the Mutabaqun who remained, and they said, we have nothing for you. And that was a great lesson. That was a great lesson. When you go to the colonizer archive, you need to manipulate. And I started presenting my question and research differently, that I'm asking about who remained in Haifa, about the coexistence. And that opened for me, honestly, at least some files. And from there, I took it to manipulate also different strategies to manipulate the archive. But it also brings me not only to the questions you ask as a researcher, but also how you, as Sana said, what are the resources of our archives, right? So oral history is also one methodology to add and maybe to combine, because sometimes researchers either use oral history or archival document to write the history. So rewriting the Palestinian history in this case, and because of the elimination of the Palestinian archive through the history, that it's still ongoing. So it's the combination between oral history and the story that people tell or conceal, do not tell, and to combine them with the documents and newspapers. And I think one of the, and this is the last thing because I don't want to exceed my time, I think knowing Hebrew is a very powerful tool. Knowing Hebrew and Arabic, then you can compare and you can reread or counter-read the Hebrew documents. And it gives you access and superiority, if you want, over resources, and of course knowing English, but Hebrew and Arabic, it gives you an advanced position that you know the language of the other while the other does not know your language. So I think the combination between these three strategies, if you want, can be very empowering for Palestinians, especially Palestinians in Israel, and they can manipulate their position, their subordinated position as second class or whatsoever, non-class even in Israel, and make it in favor of their research at least. And of course, feminist approach is very important, because I think even if I do not do research on women, I have the lens of the feminism, and I ask about the everydayness of the people, and not only official records and official, history of wars. And so this also one more, if you want, a question or phase that we can bring the ordinary people with all the contradictions of their daily life, and not only to talk about from above, bottom, it's top, bottom, but the opposite.
Yes, thank you, Ahmed. And I think that when you're talking about the contradictions, it also alludes to what Sami said about going beyond a good versus evil narrative and really unpacking the complexity of people's day-to-day lives to be able to really draw meaningful lessons from history. My last question is to you, Eliana. I recognize that we're doing this is a panel that's very focused on history, and maybe is a very disciplinary panel, an academic one, it turned out. But the audience is quite diverse in terms of the disciplines they're interested in, the professions and the practices that they do. So you're an urbanist and a designer, but you've chosen to do historical research to inform your work. So I was wondering if you can talk about how these two hats fit together, and how your training as an architect informs your historical research, and vice versa, and what you think this can bring to the rest of our audience.
Surely. I think so much of what I look at is the built environment. And often when I say I'm an architect, people just assume, I don't know, I draw buildings all day or something. The secret is I can't draw at all. But nonetheless, I said briefly in my talk, I started to view architecture as having a lot of agency. The built object itself has agency and has impact on how we perceive the world and how it writes the world's history as well. And in that realization, I came to understand that not only our contemporary architecture, but those that preceded the deeply historical architecture, similarly were telling a story that no one else was telling. And that was the core provocation into my research. And we don't have archives in Jordan. We have municipal archives, which are, let's just say, timid. They're somewhat timid archives. And so I had to sort of take to the streets, if you will. And that's really where I began to read the environment and use my training as an architect and pair that with my new training as a historian and put together this new narrative about the urban environment that hadn't really been studied in that way before. And so that, I think I'll just stop there. And that's what I did.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. So we have a number of questions that are showing up here, and I feel it's quite difficult to choose. I feel like I have too much power right now. I think I kind of prefer the random selection, but let's see how this is going to work. There is one Salim in the room. Maybe we can pass the mic to Salim for him to ask his question, since it's been voted up. There's a voting system as well, so let the people decide.
They have
I have a question for Sami. So you mentioned that secularization in early 20th century in Syria was sort of a vehicle to modernization that was manifested in the form of modern education and women's rights. However, one could argue that these perceived forms of modernization, such as educational institutions or progressive education institutions and egalitarian gender values, were not really alien to the non-secular region. And we could probably draw examples from Islamic Egypt and North Africa, where the role of women wasn't really suppressed or wasn't typically suppressed. I'm not sure if you agree, and if you do agree, how do you think and why do you think the Ottomans deviated from this, what some could believe to be a more progressive Islamic civilization, to a more radical and policing ruler of the region? And was it this, as I probably understand it, a way to curb the influence of the Egyptians in the 19th century, or was it more deeply rooted?
Sami, before you answer, there's another question for you that I will also let Hanna to ask. Day, could you pass the mic to Hanna? And then you could just answer both
Sure.
in one go.
Sure.
Hi. My question is about the Damascus tramway lines. They always seemed like a good, clean, modern solution for public transport, but why were they decommissioned? Was it just a matter of diesel is cheaper, or did something change in terms of legalization and investments in the area? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with the second question, which the answer is brief. The decision to do away with the tramway was actually taken in late 1957. Postponed till 58. 58 came the union, and it just kept getting postponed till late 1961 until the infisal. The reason behind it was that due to the influx of cars and their steady availability, not many people were riding the tram any longer by the late 1950s and early 1960s. They were costing the municipality of Damascus way too much money. So they began to dismantle them in late 1961 onto 1962. There were 6 lines, 5 were discontinued completely by 1962. One line, which led to the Duma, remained operational because it was the line that used to take workers to the Al-Khumasiyya and other factories in the countryside of Damascus. So it was purely for economic reasons that the tramway was dismantled under the presidency of Nazim al-Qudsi, late 1961, early 1962. Now, yes, they were clean, and yes, they were very efficient. I think it was a mistake. It was a grave mistake on behalf of the municipality, but too late now. With regard to the first question about the reform-oriented state and society, yes, there were cities in the Ottoman Empire that were more advanced than Damascus in terms of modernization, among which was Aleppo. Mariana Marrash, as early as the 1890s, was holding an intellectual saloon at her home. In 1893, there were 6 Syrian women. Syrian, when we say Syrian at the time, they were referring to the entire region, not the geographic location that we know now. 6 Syrian women were invited to attend the Chicago International Fair, the Columbus Fair. It was named after Christopher Columbus. Only one went. Now, in modern times, we call her Lebanese. She was from Kafar Shima. Her name was Hannah Korani. The invitees were from Beirut, from Sidon, from Tyre, from Aleppo, but none from Damascus. Damascus was way too conservative to accept and to digest such a revolutionary change in its social structure. Women remained behind the high walls of their homes until really the first attempt at breaking that was in 1910, when they established the first women's magazine that was run by women and founded by a lady called Mary Ajam. Again, was an AUB graduate. She studied nursing at AUB. So the Ottomans did it out of political need. They did it out of a feeling that if they encourage reforms and if they create a strong central government in Istanbul, where other major cities, including ones like Damascus, were treated well and furnished with funds and good walis, governors, then that would increase loyalty to the Ottoman state. So it was not really about reform in as much as it was about reforming the system in order to secure continuity of the Ottoman order.
Thank you, Sami. Thank you. Okay, then I'm going to take a couple more questions. They're actually both for you, Ilyana. We'll see. And then I'm going to ask Himmat and Sana to comment on one very popular question that I will end with. So there's Jamima in the audience, and there is Mu'taz also in the audience. So if we could both ask your questions to Ilyana, and then it doesn't, matter. Yes, go, whoever has the mic.
Thank you very much. So my question is, you said one of the key reasons behind these sort of desert buildings in the middle of Amman, what administrative, because of administrative failings, how would you suggest going about introducing accountability for these administrative failings?
Thank you, Eliana. First of all, I really like what you said about the Jordan Gate project, and it is a really big issue in Jordan, and a constant reminder of the failure of urban planning and throughout the city. The one thing that I wanted to ask you is, recently the Prime Minister of Jordan, Bashar al-Khassawi, mentioned that they have plans of completing the buildings and using them for government purposes. The one thing that I wanted to ask you was, based on your research, do you think that there is sufficient urban planning in that area? Because it is one of the busiest areas in Amman, given that all ministries will be in that central location with a limited amount of parking and limited amount of access to those buildings. And if not, if you think that is a bad idea, what do you propose that those buildings be used for, whether public or private sector?
I think I'll start with your question first. There's a very simple reality related to the Jordan Gate Towers. There's 2 cranes I talked about that are still in place. Those cranes have now rusted in place. In order to continue with the construction, you would have to take down those cranes and then put up new cranes for the construction. But we know that the reason, in large part, why the whole project failed was it was placed in an area that had one-way streets surrounding it, narrow one-way streets. So you can no longer now, with the increase in population and crowdedness, you can't even pull in the trucks you need to demolish the crane, let alone put up the new cranes, let alone complete the building. So I'm not going to say this isn't true. How would I know? It could very possibly happen. But I think, speaking from logistics, I don't know how that could be possible to finish such a project. Never mind the fact that there isn't enough electrical, transformers to power the building. There's not enough water resources to pump water through the building. There's insufficient number of underground parking for the people who would require to park and live in that building. So there's a whole slew of reasons why that building was really poorly planned, poorly sited, poorly constructed. But to be clear, the reason it was chosen to be there, it was from the airport road. And if you've ever, we're all from the Middle East, right? You know the airport road is important. And so when you come in from the airport to Amman, that's what you first see, 6th circle. And the towers were meant to signify sort of as an emblem of modernity for Amman. And you were meant to be awed and wowed and understand Amman to be a modern city. And so now what we understand it to be is an incomplete city, unfortunately, right? So, it's a great segue to your question, what would I do, or what would I suggest to improve accountability? I think that's a really impossible task. In large part, it has to do with the tribal allegiances and the power of the tribes in Amman, al-Ashair. And so, bil-Ashair, there's a lot of, favor system? We all know the wasla, right? Like the wasla system dominates. It almost becomes like a sub-legal system. And as a result, policing and policy gets to be really muddled. And in large part, many of these developmental decisions get scooted under past municipal regulations due to this favor system. And in some part, sometimes it's really beneficial to us, right? It's great when someone recognizes you and you get out of a speeding ticket, for example. That's a great benefit. But the parochialism, the patriarchy, so deeply embedded in the social structures of Amman are hugely problematic, and I do not see a way that we're going to ever escape these powers, these social powers, and supersede their importance and relevance to do something such as regulate a city. It's just a foreign concept altogether.
Thank you. Okay, I know everyone's hungry. At least I'm very hungry. But before we go to lunch, I just asked the last question that was asked virtually and had the most votes up. And I think it's quite a provocative question, actually. I'll let Himmat and Sana address. And it's from Mahmoud, who said, do you think it would have been better for Syria, but also the Levant countries in general, to stay under European mandate instead of being independent? Which is a question we hear quite commonly, actually. So I'll leave it to you to reflect on that. Himmat, if you want to go first.
It's a common question, but I can tell that I have a clear answer for that. And no, that very direct, clear answer for that. It's not better for that. And I think Palestine is the great example of colonization, that the opposite, it destroyed what democratic organization we had, and the habitus, if you want, the urban habitus that we had, and that it did not start. I definitely, I think that rereading the history, we should not deny the influence and the contribution, if you want, of the colonization to the prosperity of our cities. But that started much earlier than the British mandate in Palestine. And I agree with Sami that it has to do with the interest of the Ottoman Empire, but this is the way with all imperialism and colonialism. The colonialism in Palestine did not improve the Palestinian reality for the benefit of the indigenous, but for its own benefit. So all reforms, state reform, imperial reforms, colonialism reform, it's came or initiated in favor of the colonizer, or the imperial. So I think it's interesting to see how the ordinary people, what is used to say, we used to name them in the academia, the ordinary people, but they also give back, and they're part of building and empowering the society. So my clear, direct answer is no. Definitely there is a different condition and power relation between West and East that play and still playing role in what we see today in our societies. But at the same time, we can see how what I call in my new research, the creative class, the Palestinian, in this case, creative class, is confronting internal constraints, social constraints, but at the same time confronting the colonization and ongoing colonization of Palestine. So this is possible. It's possible that we, as the agent, as the indigenous, as the owner of this region, do better without the colonizer. And thank you.
Thank you, Himmat. Sana, any concluding words and thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I won't repeat what Himmat said because I completely agree with everything that she said. I think the question should be, why are we asking this question? So if we're asking this question because we believe that we cannot rule ourselves, or we have done a bad job in ruling ourselves, I think that exactly is the remnant of colonialism in the region. It has convinced us that and it has worked so well when it was colonizing, right? When colonization was still happening, that we cannot rule ourselves, that we need guardianship, that we need someone to allow us and help us to rule, right? So if we're convinced with that, I think that is in and of itself just a real evidence of the success of colonialism. So I think what we should ask is, how can we imagine different ways? Yes, what we have now is not good, if we're going to use the word good. Yes, colonialism, obviously brought us to this point in which we ask this question of, was it better to be under colonialism? The question should be, how much are we willing to imagine different futures for us that are very different from the past, because the past was as hurtful, as harmful, as unjust as it was? I think this should be our question.
Well, thank you very much for that, Sana. And actually, this is what we're going to be talking about the rest of the day. So it's quite a perfect way to conclude our panel. Please give a round of applause to our speakers. Before we go to lunch, I'm supposed to instruct you to follow the committee members to take a group photo. And that's on the way to lunch, so don't worry. It's not going to take too much time. And then we'll be back here at 1 for the next panel. Thank you very much.